Hello, this is Richard Murphy, and I've been asked to talk about an issue of some importance to many people, which is whether or not we are going to see an increase in interest rates, which is going to massively increase the cost of what is called the national debt. And the reason why this is of interest to people at the moment is that people like Robert Peston are saying that this is a big threat to the government. Well, let you tell me that, as is not uncommonly the case, Robert Peston has got this wrong. Now, let me put this in some context, and there's going to be some numbers. The forecast interest cost for the coming year by the government in March, which was of course wrong, but let's take that forecast as being the best estimate we've got, was £56 billion. That was on a national debt that existed then of about, according to the Office for National Statistics, £1.7 trillion or £1,700 billion. Put those numbers together and the implied interest rate was around 3.3% on the national debt at that time. Now, let's now roll forward to December 2020. The national debt has of course risen by over £300 billion roughly since then, or at least according to the Office for National Statistics it has. I may not agree with that. But the point is that the amount of that debt that has been sold to the public is almost nothing. And by public, I mean banks and pension funds and life insurance companies and foreign debt owners. In fact, foreign debt owners have reduced their involvement in the UK economy over that period. Why has so little been sold to them? Because the Bank of England has acquired almost every penny in net terms of debt issued since March 2020, since the coronavirus crisis developed. And they've done that by buying debt back from the financial markets. The consequence of that buying of the debt back is that, of course, it's no longer owed to third parties. Now, actually, as at 31st March, around £435 billion of the national debt, or roughly a quarter of the total national debt at that time, was owned by the Bank of England. So of the £56 billion that was forecast to be paid, around £14 billion went straight back to the government. So the £56 billion was overstated because, in fact, it was really a net cost of £42 billion for the national debt in the coming year, or roughly 5% of government expenditure, give or take a bit. Now, national debt has been replaced this year entirely by new debt issues. Notionally, the interest rate on these is 0.3% on average, but in practice, because of quantitative easing, the actual real interest that is paid is the amounts paid to banks and building societies who hold balances with the Bank of England, which are the consequence of debt being repurchased, because the money that is paid to them is held by them on deposit with the Bank of England. That's the net outcome. And they are paid 0.1% on the balances they now hold. To put that in context, £800 billion, roughly, of government debt is now held by UK banks and building societies. In effect, the only representation of that debt is, in effect, the accounts that they hold with the Bank of England. And if they are paid 0.1% on that, that's £800 million a year. Now, I could live on that, and I'm sure you could too. But compare that to the £56 million that the government says it was going to pay this year, or even the net £42 billion that it says it was going to pay after the return of the money on the gilts that it owns, the debt that it owns, then you will see that £800 billion compared to £42 billion, or that's 0.8 billion compared to 42 billion, is nothing. And that is on 40% or more of the debt now in existence. Now, what Robert Peston is obsessing about is that the interest rate on those deposit accounts held with the Bank of England will go up, and that will somehow create a massive debt burden. Well, again, let's just talk about some numbers. The Office for Budget Responsibility did, in their forecast with regard to the spending review at the end of November, say that interest rates will go up in the UK between now and 2025. How much did they say it will go up by? From 0.1% to probably into negative territory next year, because we can have negative real interest rates, and then will rise again by 2025 to 0.3%. In other words, that 800 million, which we're paying now, could rise to 2.5 billion, maybe 3 billion. In other words, inconsequential sums compared to the overall national debt. And let's remember that over the next 5 years, 1/3 of the UK's overall national debt, on average, will be redeemed. In other words, come to the end of its life and be replaced by new debt. Because that's what happens when an old debt comes to the end of its life. It isn't just, paid off and forgotten. A new debt is issued to replace it. But new debts are being issued at 0.3%, whereas old debts were being issued at, on average, 3.3%, according to the government forecast earlier this year. So at 1/10 of the cost of the debt they're replacing. So over the next 5 years, roughly 1/3 of all the debt interest costs will collapse by 90%. I hope you're following this. That means that instead of roughly 13 to 14 billion of interest costs being paid on 1/3 of the national debt at the cost that existed in March this year, only about 1 billion of costs will replace that. So the saving will be 13 billion. And if the cost of the bank deposit accounts with the Bank of England goes up threefold, which is the maximum that the Office for Budget Responsibility suggests, the cost will go up by 3 billion at the absolute maximum, and probably less than that. In other words, we will be paying vastly less overall in interest, even if interest rates go up as much as the Office for Budget Responsibility propose, than we were as a proportion of total government spending in 2025 compared to 2020, despite any increase in the national debt in the meantime. So is this an issue we need to worry about when the cost is virtually inevitably, and I mean, well, so virtually inevitably that you can ignore the possibility of anything else happening, going to go down significantly? The precise amount it will go down by may not be, as I've just suggested, 90%. It may only be 70%. Whichever one it is, we are still going to be vastly better off than we were before 2020 began with regard to the costs of servicing government debt, simply because interest rates are now so low compared to when most of the national debt was issued, and simply because the amount of money held on deposit account with the Bank of England is so large, and the Bank of England can control that interest rate. Remember, it sets the rate, the banks don't. And because it is so tiny compared to the cost of the debt that it replaces, that we don't have to worry about it. Robert Peston is wrong. Those who are fantasizing about some form of debt crisis because of this interest charge have not done the numbers. The reality is that interest costs as a proportion of our national spending are going to be tiny for a long time to come. And that, bluntly, is good news, because we can put the money to better use and we don't have to worry about that. It's going to happen, as a matter of fact, simply because these changes are effectively already built into the system. They can't be avoided by anyone, because interest rates on old debt are much higher than any possible interest rates that will be payable in the future. So rest easy. Don't lose sleep about this. There is no problem. Thanks for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, I'm pleased. If you want to see other videos like this, there are links below this screen. If you want to subscribe, hit the subscribe button. Follow me on Twitter as well, @RichardJMurphy. Look at my blog, Tax Research UK. And if you'd like to donate, because this video series is being largely paid for by donations, there is a donations button on every single post on my blog. Thanks a lot.